In San Francisco, and this is Bloomberg Technology. Coming up in the next hour, the big China hack revealed by Bloomberg via Supermicro didn't just impact hardware, but also software, and Facebook and Apple were hit. We'll have more. Plus, another tweet storm from Elon Musk. The Tesla CEO fired off more than a dozen messages, lashing out at the SEC and short sellers. Could it jeopardize the settlement he struck just days ago? And Tencent Music's $1 billion IPO plans continuing the surge of U.S. listings by China companies. Spotify is a competitor and an investor. We'll ask what it means for the streaming music landscape. But first, to our top story, we are continuing our look at the bombshell Bloomberg Businessweek report about how China pulled off the most significant known supply chain attack ever on U.S. companies. We now know that China managed to install a hardware hack in the server centers of nearly 30 U.S. companies, but China didn't stop there. Malicious software was introduced from a Supermicro software portal. That code allowed the attackers to secretly take over a server's communications. One customer targeted was Facebook, which told Bloomberg in an emailed statement, in 2015, we were made aware of malicious manipulation of software related to Supermicro hardware from industry partners through our threat intelligence industry sharing programs. While Facebook has purchased a limited number of Supermicro hardware for testing purposes confined to our labs, our investigations reveal that it has not been used in production, and we are in the process of removing them. In Washington, we've got one of the authors of this investigation, Bloomberg Tech's Jordan Robertson, and in New York, Sam Sachs, Senior Fellow for Tech Policy at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Jordan, I want to start with you because now you are reporting that we're looking at 3 potential avenues of attack here, including the hardware attack that we talked about yesterday. Walk us through these 3 different avenues of attack.
Sure. Thanks for having me on, Emily. Here's what we're looking at. So we reported yesterday on the added chips, the malicious chips that were added to Supermicro motherboards that wound up inside Apple and Amazon and dozens of other companies. But that wasn't it. That wasn't the only element of this attack. It was the most significant. But what according to U.S. officials, according to what the Chinese hackers also allegedly did, was infect a Supermicro customer portal where customers would go to update both the firmware and the software on their servers. So what this meant was, if you didn't get the malicious chips in your network, you might have gotten these other elements of the attack. So it was basically, it's a way to attack hardware in 3 different ways to access sensitive networks. It's quite a sophisticated and broad type of attack.
Now, talk to us about how Apple specifically, they've denied the hardware hack, but they have acknowledged a malware hack. Explain.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I'll walk you through what we reported. I mean, what we reported was that Apple discovered 3 different types of hardware manipulations involving its servers. One was the discovery of the added malicious chips in Supermicro servers. 2 was the presence of outdated firmware on the network card of their servers, and the third was the presence of malicious firmware on the Supermicro website. So these were all attacks that happened in 2015 that Apple was aware of. What Apple mentions in its statement, and as anyone who's read the story knows, there is a big gap between what we report and what Apple and Amazon say. But what Apple says happened was that there was a minor software infection a year after the events that we described from that same Supermicro portal, and that's the reason Apple says it cut off Supermicro as a supplier.
Now, Sam, as Jordan and our colleague Mike Riley have reported, there is still an open U.S. government investigation into these issues. What are you hearing in the intelligence community about this?
You know, I think there's a lot of debate right now. The problem is that the information needed to verify this is so sensitive. Whether it's companies themselves don't really know, who would have access to this information is very limited. And then within the government, it's highly unlikely that we're going to see displayed publicly the kind of information that information security professionals would need to be able to verify what happened. So we're going to need to just watch how this plays out.
So then how does this play out behind the scenes, do you imagine?
I think that we could be looking at a congressional hearing perhaps in the future. You know, the timing of this is also very interesting because the news broke the same day that we have Vice President Pence's speech, in which he essentially says, look, we're in a technology and cyberspace conflict with China that's only getting deeper. So this is just one piece of a deepening conflict that we're going to see across multiple fronts with China.
Jordan, when we talk about these three different avenues of attack, do they all go back to China? You know, if China could have, accomplished this, God hardware hack, why would they need to do all of these other kinds of things?
Sure, good question. Yeah, according to our sources, the same group responsible for the added chips, the added components to the motherboards, was also responsible for the compromise of Supermicro's customer software portal. And it's a really good question. Like, if you can modify hardware at the factory, the thing that we report that Amazon and Apple found, why would you need to do anything else? And the short answer is, these attackers want every avenue they can possibly get into sensitive facilities. So, and if the hardware implants are discovered, a customer portal is a great way to impact a number of other users. If the added chips are very hard to put into computer servers. So they want easier ways as well, and these other vectors of attack accomplish that.
Is any one of these attacks worse than the other? I know we talked about a unicorn jumping over a rainbow, this hardware hack. Is that the worst of it?
Well, the added chip that we reported yesterday, that is the most sophisticated. It is the hardest to detect. It's impossible to remove. However, this idea of modifying firmware, of modifying the code on legitimate chips, that's an easier attack, and in many ways it can accomplish the same thing. You can have a technical debate about which is harder, which is more permanent, but modifying firmware in many ways is the simpler attack. It lasts just as long, and it's equally as damaging.
Sam, what do you believe the ramifications of this will be all the way back to China?
For Chinese customers around the world, there is so much suspicion. So China's trying to sell 5G to invest in their own indigenous chip industry. Nobody's going to want to buy from China now. So I think this has deep ramifications. It shows that sometimes Beijing's security goals directly undermine their global commercial ambitions.
And how do you think it will impact the relationship between the U.S. and China, which is already, high tension?
I think this is going to accelerate what we're seeing as a decoupling between the industrial and the technology relationship between our two countries. We're already seeing discussions of blocking Chinese students in the U.S. I'm looking next to potential bans on Huawei and ZTE coming out from the administration. This justifies it and accelerates a trend already underway to drive a wedge between the two countries.
Jordan, I know you're continuing to pull the strings here. What else are you looking at? What are we waiting for?
Well, yeah, the report yesterday was really just the tip of the iceberg. I mean, once we started looking at hardware, and we got that tip, which I should note the first tip came during the Obama administration from some private sector folks. But once we started looking at hardware and hardware security, it opened up a whole new world of reporting to us, and we have a lot more to come. Related to how do you secure hardware, what is found on hardware in some of these data centers. It's a very interesting space, and the big lesson is you're not going to find this stuff unless you look, and then once you look, you're going to find some very, very interesting things.
All right, Bloomberg's Jordan Robertson, great reporting. Sam Sachs of CSIS, thank you both. We're going to continue to follow this story. Of course, you can read Jordan's full story in this week's edition of Bloomberg Business Week. We should note also that Bloomberg LP has been a Supermicro customer, but found no evidence to suggest that Bloomberg has been affected by the hardware issues raised in this article. Coming up, Elon Musk takes to Twitter yet again. Did he put his recent settlement with the SEC at risk? We will discuss. And if you like Bloomberg News, check us out on the radio, listen on the Bloomberg app, Bloomberg.com, and in the U.S. on SiriusXM. This is Bloomberg. Well, Tesla seemed to have finally quelled investor fears earlier this week with its stellar production numbers. The good news was short-lived. Tesla shares plunged after CEO Elon Musk went into overdrive late Thursday with more than a dozen tweets targeting the Securities and Exchange Commission and short sellers. In one post, he mocked the SEC, saying, quote, just want to that the short seller enrichment commission is doing incredible work and the name change is on point. Believe he meant to say just want to say there, but looks like he was moving pretty quickly. He then continued his tirade, tweeting, quote, short sellers are value destroyers, should definitely be illegal. The tweet storm comes less than a week after Musk settled a lawsuit with the SEC over his funding-secured tweet. The deal, which has yet to be finalized, would remove Musk as chairman and implement controls over his communications and social media use. Here to talk about this further, Bloomberg Business Week's Max Chafkin. So, Max, well, that didn't last long. Could these tweets compromise this settlement with the SEC?
Yeah, I mean, it's possible that the deal is not final, and you know, as part of the deal, Tesla is not supposed to sort of say that it, you know, dispute the general thrust of the accusation. This feels kind of like a borderline thing. I mean, you know, Musk could argue that he's just sort of making a dad joke or something, but it definitely feels like a company that's not fully in control. And one thing that's sort of strange about this whole thing is that Tesla's stock was actually doing pretty well. It's not as if the short sellers were hammering it or anything. Now this just looks like another self-inflicted wound.
And look, is this going to revive questions about his fitness to be running this company?
You'd have to think that some people are going to bring it up. I mean, especially, you know, considering the sort of nature of the tweets where you have a bunch of them and as you said, there's some sort of typos and things like that. Again, though, the problem here for Tesla and for the SEC is that Tesla doesn't, it's hard to imagine Tesla existing without Elon Musk. And a lot of the reason that customers are buying the cars, are fans of the company, has to do with this very colorful, you know, guy. And so it's hard to imagine the SEC saying, oh, well, now he has to step down as CEO, because that would, you know, that would probably hurt the value of the stock and ultimately hurt investors. On the other hand, when you have a situation where somebody, you know, is just sort of not listening to the thrust of what board members or regulators are saying, it's sort of hard to know where you go.
Now, a federal judge still has to decide whether the penalties that were agreed to are fair. You know, what do you imagine is happening behind the scenes with regulators right now, knowing the swiftness with which they moved to open this investigation in the first place?
Well, an article that my colleagues published earlier today, you know, said that basically, you know, you could imagine the SEC reading the Riot Act, at least to his lawyer, saying, hey, you really, you know, we really mean it now that you have to, you know, not call us the short seller enrichment commission. But again, beyond that, I'm not really sure. And so I guess you could imagine, you know, the SEC bring the lawsuit again and trying to get a deeper penalty. But who knows? I mean, hopefully, you know, from the point of view of Tesla investors, Elon Musk will basically stay off of Twitter. And yesterday we saw some of, you know, the biggest bulls basically tweeting at him, telling, you know, hey, settle down. Let's not, you know, throw a wrench in the machine right now.
Right, and recent history would show that would lead us to not expect that to happen. You've got earnings coming up in a month. Now, as you mentioned, the production numbers look good. Things were moving in the right direction. What does Tesla have to do in the next few weeks to get to sort of from point A to point B?
Well, I mean, in the next few weeks, I mean, they have to just keep the production going, and we don't really know, you know, whether they, you know, what exactly they did to get those production numbers to look so good. Maybe, you know, they had, you know, they maybe were throwing tons of people at it. I mean, what they need to do is make those cars sustainably. And I guess the other important thing, and at this point, now that the production stuff is figured out, it's maybe more important, is that they need to sell these cars and get them delivered. And again, we've been seeing these kind of reports about various sort of delivery problems or issues with customer service. And then there's also just sort of the long-term question of, will people who've expressed interest in buying this thing, will they then pony up? We've seen Tesla, you know, throwing out all these incentives, including, you know, free supercharging. Recently, there was a promise that they would send a little picture into space for Tesla customers. So they're trying all sorts of things to sort of get, you know, make sure that demand is there as production ramps up. And if they're able to do that, I mean, then this looks like a very successful car company. It looks like a company that is, you know, has a car that's, you know, on the level of the biggest mass market cars, at least in the United States.
We'll be watching the tweets. As always, Bloomberg Business Week's Max Chafkin, thanks so much for stopping by. Coming up, lingerie shopping has gone digital. How Third Love is using data and machine learning to take down Victoria's Secret. Next. And Bloomberg Tech is live streaming on Twitter. You can check us out at Technology, and be sure to follow our global breaking news network TikTok on Twitter. This is Bloomberg. Samsung Electronics has posted yet another record operating profit, topping estimates. But concerns still remain over weakening demand for memory chips. Our Chief North Asia correspondent Stephen Engel has more from Hong Kong.
Resilient. That's the best way to describe Samsung's memory chip sales in the third quarter, and that could ease concern about a potential drop-off in chip demand that's been long predicted as this chip supercycle tries to plow forward. Memory chips helped Samsung's operating profit rise to another record last quarter, topping estimates to 17.5 trillion won. That's 15.5 billion US dollars. Still, this could be the peak for operating profit as contract prices for 32 gigabit DRAM server modules fell last quarter for the first time since 2016, albeit modestly. And 128 gigabit MLC NAND flash chips fell nearly 7%, that on waning demand and excess supply. Now, memory chips account for the biggest portion of Samsung's profit. And there's concern, too, about smartphone demand. Handset sales have been sluggish amid challenges from Chinese rivals. Investors, well, they've taken note. Shares are down this year. One Nomura fund manager in Taiwan actually has sold all of the 4.3 million Samsung shares that she held, citing a slowdown in the global economic cycle. Stephen Engel, Bloomberg News, Hong Kong.
Well, Victoria's Secret owner L Brands is the worst performer in the S&P 500 this year. With its stock down more than 50%, the retailer is struggling to adapt to the rise of e-commerce and changing consumer tastes. Its struggles have allowed a number of startups to steal market share in intimate apparel. One of the most successful is Third Love, now one of the fastest growing consumer companies in America. As part of a series looking at retail disruption, Emma Chandra spoke with founder and CEO Heidi Zak, who said that technology is at the heart of Third Love's success.
We are a direct-to-consumer, e-commerce, vertically integrated brand that makes very comfortable bras and underwear.
And so you said this, the genesis of this was going into a Victoria's Secret store and not liking their offering, not liking the association with that brand. How has Third Love disrupted what Victoria's Secret does and others?
Sure, a few different ways. So one, really focusing on product quality and a range of sizes. So we have 70 sizes. Victoria's Secret offers about 36. So we have more than double, including half sizes. So I always say shoes have half sizes. Why shouldn't bras, right? And then there's the marketing. So we use real women in our marketing instead of models, and just a lot of diversity. And we also leverage data to help women find their fit online.
You rely heavily on data and machine learning, and that actually helps you make business and product decisions. How does that work?
So if you think about how you get fit for a bra, usually a woman might come into a room with a measuring tape, or she'll size you up and bring you bras that should work for you. What we've done is we've digitized that experience. We created a fit finder, so in under 60 seconds, you can answer questions about your breast shape, body type, fit issues, and we'll recommend a size and style. Over 10 million women have actually done the fit finder. We have a massive amount of data. We have over 700 million data points.
So you've used the data that you've had to refine the product, so to speak?
Yes, so we use the data for product development and design, for thinking about sizes and specs. We use it in marketing and personalization, and we use it in inventory management. So across every aspect of the business, we're using data day in and day out.
So is Third Love really a tech company rather than an apparel company?
I think we're a blend for sure. I mean, absolutely, data and tech is at the core of what we do, but we also create really beautiful product, which is considered to be, I would say, retail as well.
You used to work at Google. How has that informed what you do at Third Love?
Yeah, so at Google, I really at Google, I really learned to push the boundaries and think about kind of new ways of solving problems, and really applied that to Third Love. But I also had been in retail in New York at a traditional retailer. I was at Aeropostale after business school. So it's really that blend of retail and tech coming together in terms of my background that I think made me comfortable to start this company.
And does that differentiate you from the competition, do you think?
Absolutely. I mean, I think most people who are running companies in the space either just have a tech background or just have a retail background, don't necessarily have that blend.
And you need to blend it for the modern consumer.
Absolutely.
You say Third Love is already profitable. Can you tell us a little bit more about how profitable and your expectations for growth?
Yeah, so we've been growing over 300% year on year since we were founded in 2012. So we've seen substantial growth. We have 1.5 million customers, and we, continue to take on more and more market share.
And do you think the industry, there are varying figures for how big the US intimate apparel industry and the global industry is. How much do you think of that? How much of that industry can you penetrate?
So Victoria's Secret, depending on the numbers that you look at, owns somewhere between a third to 45–50% of the market. So there's a substantial amount of market share to be taken, I think, given they're the worst performing stock on the S&P this year.
Now, can you give us an idea of what kind of percentage of the market you have now?
A few basis points, I'd say.
Third Love is one of the fastest growing companies in America. That often happens when you're a new company. You have some big name investors behind you as well. What is the next step for Third Love? Are you thinking that you would be acquired, you would do deals? Might we see you go public?
Those are all possibilities right now. I'm having a great time impacting millions of women's lives and just making a difference in the world, so focused on just growing the business right now.
That's a very nice answer, but your investors must be wanting something a little bit more specific than that.
Our investors are actually very patient because they know we're building a brand and that brands take a really long time to build, so they're just really focused on the same thing we are.
That was Third Love CEO Heidi Zak with Bloomberg's Emma Chandra. Coming up, how will Congress respond to the news of China's supply chain hack on the United States? We will ask a member of the House Intelligence Committee next. Our conversation with Representative Chris Stewart of Utah coming up. And later, Spotify hit the public market early this year, and now competitor Tencent Music is ramping up for its U.S. IPO. We'll chat with an investor who backs both music streaming companies. This is Bloomberg. This is Bloomberg Technology in San Francisco. I'm Emily Chang. Back to our top story, the continued fallout over the Bloomberg Businessweek investigation, revealing the extent to which China has hacked U.S. tech companies like Apple and Amazon. Something that didn't seem to surprise the White House's top economic advisor, Larry Kudlow. Take a listen to what he had to say earlier today on Bloomberg Television.
I think it's a good thing to be on guard because our Chinese so-called friends have done a lot of mischief in that area, not least of which, in addition to these chips and stealing of technology, cyber hacking.
Now I want to get the view of someone in Congress about this hack. Congressman Chris Stewart represents Utah's 2nd District and is also a member of the House Intelligence Committee. He joins us now from Utah. Representative Stewart, thank you so much for joining us. What is your initial reaction to this report from Bloomberg?
Well, if this is true, and I can't comment on specificity whether this is actually true or not for a number of reasons, but let's speak kind of generally. If this is true, this is the holy grail of hacking. This isn't, implementing software or implanting software and being able to gain access by that. They apparently did this in the manufacturing process, which makes it much, much harder to detect, nearly impossible to counter. And it opens every one of us up, whether it's privacy issues, whether it's commerce, whether it's banking, or worst of all, national security implications. This is a very serious concern. And by the way, the fact we discovered this doesn't mean, oh, good, man, we dodged a bullet. It's not like this is the only effort that China has made. We have to, as you just said, we have to be constantly on guard and constantly on the defensive about this.
The top Democrat on the House Intelligence Committee, Adam Schiff, has said he's looking to get more information about how this might have happened from U.S. intelligence agencies. How might you go about doing that, getting that information?
Well, we can have conversations with them, but I got to tell you, this isn't something new to us. It's not like we woke up this morning and go, oh my gosh, never thought about this. We ought to check into it. It's something we've been very diligent about and very aggressive in trying to pursue this type of information and making sure that we are in the right position. And by the way, the good news is that this administration has been much more proactive and much more aggressive in putting ourselves in a position where we can defend about this. And that's one of the arguments I've been making for a while. The previous administration was far too willing to just kind of suffer these hacks and not really have any retribution or have any price to be paid. And I just think it encouraged it, and it just made it too easy for our adversaries to say, well, let's go poke and prod and plant and see what we can do. But we have to be more aggressive in countering this. China should pay a price for having done this. And again, by the way, it's not the only thing that China is doing that is making it difficult for us to have a positive relationship with them. Look at the South China Sea. Look at any number of things that we should be on guard with regarding China.
What do you believe is the price China should pay for this?
Well, I mean, there's a couple things. One of them should be that it should be well known and advertised that they are doing this. And so manufacturers who have moved so much of their manufacturing to China, but for economic reasons, would then consider there are other concerns that we would have to weigh that against. Maybe it's not smart to open up a new chip manufacturing facility in China. Maybe we should do it in Vietnam or maybe, hopefully, here in the United States. So I think that would be the first thing that I would hold them accountable for is the economic impacts of it. But there's more than that as well, which is why some of our negotiations regarding trade and sanctions is an important part of this conversation.
So what action do you believe the committee should take?
Well, the first thing is to be aware of it, obviously, as Mr. Schiff has said, and as I just said to you, it's not the first time we've considered this, to continue to dive into it as best we can to make the American people aware, especially decision makers, business and government decision makers. I mean, my heavens, one of the things that I'm concerned about is that potentially this chip that has been hacked in a very, very dangerous way, that those servers may find themselves as part of a contract to provide cloud computing for the Pentagon or for the CIA, and we know that that's, if it hasn't been done, it's certainly a possibility, and that's the kind of thing that the committee would be diving into and just demanding to know, the implications of that.
Do you want to hear from the companies? Do you want to hear from Apple and Amazon and Supermicro?
Well, yeah, of course we would. I mean, we can't understand this without talking to the manufacturing and talking to those who are distributing these products. And we don't want to do it with a pointing finger. It's not like we want to go with a hammer on their head and condemn them, especially before we really understand what happened. And by the way, it's not just Apple and Amazon. The distributor and the manufacturer of this particular server has been widely disseminated, according to reports, once again, and something more than 30 manufacturers have this type of equipment. But we can't understand the problem, at least not in its entirety, without talking to the manufacturers and those who are on the commercial side, not just the government side. We really got to look at both.
Now, since we're in the midst of the Mueller investigation, there's a lot of talk about how big a threat Russia is. Do you believe China is a bigger threat than Russia?
Well, it depends on what you mean by threat, actually. I mean, when it comes to if you want to look backward in our 2016 election, our focus was clearly on Russia, and it should have been on Russia, and needs to continue to be. But again, I've argued for a couple of years, we're turning a blind eye sometimes when we focus on only one side of the world, and that's towards Russia, because China has proven they're not a trusted partner and they're not a trusted friend. And if you were to ask me strategically, looking at the next generation, our children, and the challenges they're going to face, I think I could argue pretty convincingly that China is the greatest threat that we face in a very strategic sense.
Vice President Mike Pence made a speech yesterday about his concerns around China. Take a quick listen to what he had to say.
Beijing has mobilized covert actors, front groups, and propaganda outlets to shift Americans' perception of Chinese policy. As a senior career member of our intelligence community told me just this week, what the Russians are doing pales in comparison to what China is doing across this country.
Would you go that far, Congressman, that it pales in comparison to what China is doing?
Well, I think the Vice President is right, and whether I would use the word pale or maybe something a little softer modifier than that, I don't know, but what he said is exactly true. I mean, we have instances where China is taking out advertisements in the middle of our country, in the heartland, hoping to affect public policy and public perception. Look at the Confucianism centers. There's hundreds of them, more than 500 of them around the United States that we know is used as a front for Chinese intelligence and for Chinese manipulation of commerce and government. Look at how they intimidate their neighbors so that they don't take a pro-U.S. stand. I mean, I could keep going. The list is long. There's no question that what the Vice President has indicated there is absolutely true, which is why, going back to what I said previously, strategically, I think they're the greatest threat that we're going to have to face and encounter. And I don't think we've had that conversation yet where we've convinced most Americans that that is true.
On the issue of the Mueller investigation, got to ask you, do you believe that Robert Mueller is conducting a fair investigation and that the president should sit down with him with no strings attached?
Well, you know, I've always supported the Mueller investigation from the very beginning. I've always said as well, I hope he does it thoroughly, but does it as quickly as possible. I think for the sake of these individuals who have been accused, that in fairness to them, they need to have their name cleared if they're innocent. I think primarily for the benefit of the American people, I hope he does it quickly so that we can get these answers. But I support Mr. Mueller in his investigation, and I want him to go forward.
All right, Representative Chris Stewart of Utah, thanks so much for stopping by.
You.
Good to have you.
Well,
at the center of the Chinese hardware hack is a San Jose-based company, Supermicro Computers. This little-known company is actually one of the world's biggest suppliers of server motherboards. But what more do we know about Supermicro? Bloomberg Tech executive editor Tom Giles is here, and this really appears to be the mother of all hacks, if indeed, you know, it is all true as we have found. What do we know about Supermicro? Tell us more about this company.
Yeah, well, they are, as you said, one of the leading makers of motherboards. This is a crucial component to these servers that they also make, and these end up in data centers around the world. As you know, there's been so much demand as so much more information is sent digitally, more information stored, more computing done in the cloud. These companies around the world, like Apple and Amazon, have had to really beef up their data centers, which involves buying thousands and thousands of servers. One of the providers is Supermicro.
And their servers are manufactured in China.
That's right. That's right. Sometimes in their own factories, sometimes through subcontractors.
So talk to us about how Supermicro then fits into the supply chain infiltration. Right,
exactly. So investigators that we spoke to, as you talked about in the intro, working on behalf, have told us that, investigators have told us that a unit of the People's Liberation Army, very specialized unit, worked on creating this. They would basically find their way to work with subcontractors working for Supermicro, find a way to get the chips either through threats, through intimidation. They've found different ways to get the chips onto Supermicro motherboards that then found their way across the ocean into the data centers of multiple companies. The intent was to gain access to information that's traveling through the networks, whether it's IP, whether it's government secrets. Remember, some of their clients work for the government, for example.
Now, Supermicro in a statement says, while we would cooperate with any investigation, any government investigation, and Bloomberg has reported there is still an open U.S. government investigation into this. We are not aware of any investigation regarding this topic, nor have we been contacted by any government agency in this regard. We are not aware of any customer dropping Supermicro as a supplier for this type of issue, and that yet you see the shares responding, not doing well. But what do we make of this denial?
Well, we do know, for example, a couple of things. Apple dropping Supermicro as a provider, that is something that has been in the public domain for more than a year. So that is not anything new that we reported. We have new insight into it, according to the people we spoke to. So concerns about Supermicro's products, that has emerged. They disclosed a couple of years ago that they lost a couple of very high-profile customers. One of them was later found to be Apple. So again, that's been in the public domain. Customers asking questions about the reliability of their products. They've also had high-level departures in recent months. They've had questions about revenue recognition that resulted in them being delisted from the NASDAQ just in August. So there have been these questions revolving around their accounting, questions around personnel moves, questions around the reliability of their products. Again, raised when Apple dropped and another customer dropped them as a provider. So this stuff has been at a time when their sales have been rising, there's been demand for their product, there's been concerns about them as a company, and their share price had been declining even before our story went out.
All right, a lot going on behind the scenes, and I know we're continuing to pull the string here. Tom Giles, our executive editor of Bloomberg Tech, thanks so much. We should note that Bloomberg LP has been a Supermicro customer, but has found no evidence to suggest that Bloomberg has been affected by the hardware issues raised in this article. Coming up, a continued surge of U.S. listings by Chinese companies. This time, Tencent Music is filing for an IPO. We will chat with an investor in the company on its competition with Spotify next. This is Bloomberg. In IPO news, cancer detection firm Guardant Health climbed in its trading debut after raising $237.5 million in its U.S. initial public offering. The Redwood City-based company sold 12.5 million shares Wednesday for $19 each. A year and a half ago, Guardant Health took a private funding round from SoftBank and set a goal to sequence 1 million cancer patients in the next 5 years. Bloomberg's IPO reporter Alex Barinka caught up with the Guardant Health CEO and asked how that ambitious plan is going.
It's going well. We've now sequenced tens of thousands of patients, and we have a lot of opportunities behind us. We're seeing tailwinds from Medicare reimbursement in lung cancer. We're seeing a lot of private payers covering the test, and we're seeing a lot of progress in terms of using our technology platform and applying it to cancer survivors for recurrence detection, as well as using that data to apply it for early detection for the rest of us. And finally, we're seeing opportunities internationally as well. We've set up a joint venture with SoftBank to really accelerate our commercialization of our products in Asia and the Middle East, and we're very excited about the opportunities we're seeing there.
So as you said, you're in the market kind of full force in the late stage cancer patient space. You mentioned early detection. That seems kind of like the end goal for a lot of companies like yours, to be able to have a blood test that can screen for all cancers in an early detection scenario. Is that kind of what you all are going here? Is that kind of the golden goose at the end for Guardant?
No, we believe that precision oncology or precision medicine as applied to cancer has had good progress, but it's mostly been in the metastatic setting or late-stage disease setting. And so it really is often too little too late. If we can develop tests that can bring that paradigm to the earliest disease state, around where early detection is most appropriate, we believe we can fundamentally change mortality curves in cancer. And so we've had a disciplined approach from day one, starting by studying what late-stage cancer looks like in the blood, using that data, leveraging that data to then solve the problem of what early stage cancer looks like for cancer survivors, and then going eventually to early detection in a systematic approach.
And that early detection and systematic approach, you're not the only company out there who's trying to really crack the code on this one. Your former employer, Illumina, kind of created and backs Grail, which I know is a competitor, to get to that end goal. Across the market, how soon do you think it is before we see either Guardant or another company come out with a blood test that can be an early detection test for all cancers?
At this point, we're not disclosing timelines with respect to our early detection program, but I can tell you we're making rapid progress towards that goal. Later this year, we'll be launching the first series of tests for the cancer survivor market for use with biopharma companies. And we've released some data around our early detection program that looks very promising. And so I think we're quickly approaching that goal, and I would say stay tuned in terms of more data coming out of that program.
Bloomberg's Alex Barinka there with the CEO of Guardant. Sticking with IPOs, earlier this week, Tencent Music Entertainment Group filed for an initial public offering in a continuing surge of U.S. listings by Chinese companies. The online music arm of China's largest social media company listed its offering size as $1 billion as an SEC filing. The amount, however, is a placeholder and may change. For more on the filing, we're joined by Mitchell Green, founding partner of LeadEdge Capital. LeadEdge is an investor in Tencent Music. And Mitchell, Tencent's making money on only a sliver of those users. So how optimistic are you about the ability to turn this into a sustainable and profit-making business?
Well, first, thanks so much for having me on. Let's not forget, it actually is already very profitable. It's got operating margins north of 20%, and Tencent Music, or TME, I'll refer to it, is really a platform, just like Tencent has, that is leveraging these 800 million users that TME has, and I think they're going to monetize them in many ways, whether it's subscriptions, social entertainment, whether it's advertising. I think they're just starting to crack the code, and it's around 3.5% of users right now pay, and I think it's going to be multiples higher than that in the years to come. I mean, if you look at a company like Spotify, it's north of like 40% of users pay.
You're an investor in both Tencent Music and Spotify. Spotify is also an investor in Tencent Music, despite the fact that they compete, and they are increasingly competing, especially in Southeast Asia. How does that competition play out?
We don't actually, and I'd respectively disagree with you. I don't really see Spotify and Tencent competing. TME is really focused on the China market, where it dominates, frankly. Obviously in the U.S., Spotify has competition with Amazon and Apple. In China, they're it. Tencent Music, if you want to listen to music online, they own all the major music apps.
Okay, but what about Southeast Asia? You don't believe that they will increasingly, potentially compete there?
Maybe potentially very long term. Look, our thesis, we think of Tencent Music and Spotify as collaborators, not as competitors at all. I actually think the two of them as a combined entity can be a very powerful force against the music labels. I think you'll see them working a lot together, which is why there's the equity interest. TME, in order to monetize and continue to build an enormous business, is really focused on the Chinese market.
Apple Music,
they've got the users.
Okay.
No, go ahead, Sam.
Apple Music is, of course, the main competitor to Spotify, the more concerning competitor to Spotify. Pandora was just bought by SiriusXM. Does that change the game at all?
Not at all. I think Pandora was pretty much irrelevant. I believe, if you poll 100 people in the street and ask how they listen to music, especially anybody under the age of 30, you're going to get streaming. Pandora is old school. It's radio. Streaming is the future, and I believe Spotify and Tencent Music are both very well positioned to benefit hugely from that over the next decade.
But Apple isn't irrelevant. I assume you would agree. So how do Tencent Music and Spotify step up to that?
Look, Tencent Music and Apple don't compete at all. But in terms of Spotify and Apple, I believe that Spotify has I believe in the U.S. that Spotify has a far superior product to Apple, and I think that's how they've gotten to this point so far. Obviously, Apple is a very, very large company that has an enormous amount of resources that it can spend. But in a lot of our initial diligence on Spotify, we started talking to a lot of artists and things like that, and people in the music industry, and it became very clear to us that Spotify is more desired by the artists. And one thing that we haven't talked about yet is the artist tools. So Spotify and companies like Tencent Music that specialize in just music versus Apple that does a lot of things are building these unbelievable tools that enable the artists to get very granular data on their end, consumers listening to the music.
LeadEdge founding partner Mitchell Green, thanks so much for joining us. Well, this weekend on Bloomberg Television, we will bring you all our best interviews from the week, including our exclusive interview with Boeing CEO Dennis Muilenburg on just how the 102-year-old company is planning to stay relevant both on Earth and in space over the next century. Tune in Saturday for the best of Bloomberg Tech. This is Bloomberg. Saudi Arabia is upping its stake in SoftBank's Vision Fund. The Middle Eastern nation is adding $45 billion to the fund, bringing its total investment in SoftBank's Vision Fund to $90 billion. This comes days after the two denied that their $200 billion solar venture was on hold. The benchmark Asian Tech Index hit a 15-month low in the wake of Bloomberg's report that Beijing hacked American computer networks using a microchip built by its spies. Chinese PC maker Lenovo fell as much as 23%, though Lenovo says it does not do business with Supermicro, the company at the center of the investigation. And that does it for this edition of Bloomberg Technology. Have a wonderful weekend, everyone. We'll see you on Monday. I'm Emily Chang. This is Bloomberg.